Well, hello, everyone. I'm Mark Brown, and my colleague David Tilley is here. And we are going to interview Dr. Kathy Ewel today. And I have a little bit printed out that I'm going to read you about where she's been and who she is. She graduated from Cornell University in 1966 with a degree in zoology, and then completed her PhD at the University of Florida in 1970. And in between there, I think you were in Chapel Hill, and we'll get to that in a moment. Kathy began working for the School of Forest Resources and Conservation at U of F in 1973, where she conducted research in the ecology and management of wetlands and upland forests, as well as lakes. Much of her wetland research was directed at cypress swamps, and she often used simulation modeling as a research tool, especially in studies of lakes and managed pine plant plantations. She taught wetland wildlife resources as an undergraduate course and a simulation of ecological modeling as a graduate course. It was during this time that she co-edited the book Cypress Wetlands with HT Odum. In 1994, Dr. Ewel left the University of Florida to join the USDA Forest Service Institute of Pacific Island Forestry in Honolulu, Hawaii. She led the Institute's wetlands team, which conducted research on mangrove forests and freshwater forest peatlands in the Pacific Islands of Micronesia. I mean, you can't beat that. I mean, Honolulu, Hawaii for 10 years or so. In 2003, she was elected vice president of the Society of Wetland Scientists and became president in 2004 and past president in 2005. And didn't you get a Fellows Award from the Society as well?
I'm a fellow of the Society.
Yeah. Dr. Ewel retired from the Forest Service in 2005 and returned to Gainesville. She is now Professor Emerita at U of F, where she continues to work on the data that she collected in the Pacific Islands and occasionally serves on U of graduate student committees. Lucky students to have that. So, Kathy, welcome. It's a pleasure. I've known Kathy almost as long as she was. Actually, I do, because I was affiliated with the center and with HT in the beginning when you first came.
Yep.
So I'm interested in that little space between Cornell and the University of Florida, where how did you wind up in Chapel Hill? How did that happen?
Well, let's see, I came to University of Florida in '66, and I did my research on pocket gophers, and I was a vertebrate biologist. And my second semester there, I took Archie Carr's course in community ecology and met Jack Ewel. And so we were pretty quickly a couple, and the following year, he finished up a master's degree at Florida and went on to Chapel Hill to work with HT Odum. Oh. When he had graduated from forestry school at Syracuse, he went to work in Puerto Rico, and he worked on Odum's project there. Okay. And so then Jack, he spent a year there and then went off to do some land use mapping in Venezuela. And when he came back to graduate school, he intended to get a master's at UF and then wanted to go to Chapel Hill to get a PhD. So he left while I was still finishing my field work and data analysis. And then when I was ready to write, we got married, and I moved to Chapel Hill. And 3 weeks later, Jack went off to Central America to do his research. So there I was. I had to write a dissertation. And I guess I had been up there before we got married he was up there and I was at Florida. And he took me over to sit in on one of Odum's lectures. And I was quite impressed, and he must have introduced me to Odum then. I don't remember it, but he was quite a presence, I remember. And so when I was there by myself, Jack had talked about learning to do models on an analog computer, and so that really sounded interesting. When I was finishing my dissertation, I was looking at the male reproductive cycle in pocket gophers. And by this time I met Jack, and he said, well, you need to know what's happening in the environment. And so we took soil data and came up with soil moisture and soil temperature. And I found a statistician in the medical school who taught me canonical correlation and and all this fancy statistics stuff that was way beyond the two courses that I had taken. And but it kind of opened my eyes to the larger world. And so while I was at Duke, Odum was teaching his systems ecology course. So it was just a short hop from Durham to Chapel Hill. So I went over there 3 days a week to sit in on the lectures, and I learned how to use an analog computer. And I was really quite taken with it. And the guy I was working with at Duke was Steve Vogel, and we were teaching. I was helping him teach the introductory biology course. And that was a day when introductory biology was really getting a big dose of energy. People were very excited about doing it in different ways. And so Steve was doing it by using models. We looked at DNA models. We looked at water, DNA molecule. We looked at the water molecule to see what water can do and what it can't do. And so I did a little predator-prey model with a resistors and capacitor and energy source and so forth, and so we put that in too. So that was my first model, my first published model, because we did a laboratory manual with the models for it. But I have to say, I was going to when I did I guess it was when I did the seminar on how I got to know Odum and so forth, I was going to put in a picture of that little model that we did, but Steve would not do figures in that lab manual. He wanted people to read it and to use their own imagination on how they were going to do things. And so that was one way of thinking in those days. Anyway, so Odum got to know me. And then we went, when Jack finished, we started applying for jobs, and there was a recession. And so we'd apply for a job, and it would be the job would be canceled. And finally, the only real opportunity was Jack was invited to come back to University of Florida to the botany department, where he'd gotten his master's as an assistant professor. And Ariel Lugo was there already. And Ariel had been a colleague of Jack's at Chapel Hill, and there wasn't anything for me, and those were really the old days. And so when I turned up, went to the department, they said I should feel lucky that we had one job in my family.
Oh, the good old days.
But the botany department got me to teach in the we had the CS courses in those days where everybody took an introductory biology course, and so I taught a section of that a couple of times through the botany department, and Odum had urged me to do a model of the pocket gopher, and so I did a little model, and it was quite cute, but I submitted it for publication, and they said, well, she's already published the field work, and that's really all we need to know. So it didn't get accepted. But then Gustavo Antonini in the geography department was doing a project in the Dominican Republic to look at the impacts of a dam that they were going to build, the dam they were going to build on the watershed, and so I did that. I helped him, and I did that model. I modeled the whole watershed on the analog computer, and it was really quite an experience. And I really learned a lot, and it worked very well. And Gustavo and I and a graduate student who was working with us published a book on it, and it was translated into Spanish. And unfortunately, nothing could be tested because. No sooner did they put the dam in than there was a huge drought for several years, and so it never filled. And so we really couldn't, like we had said, if this much sediment will accumulate if the watershed is deforested, but if some of it's in pasture, this is how much sediment there'll be, and this sort of thing. And so it did open people's eyes, I think, and it certainly opened my eyes. And so then the Corps of Engineers, I think Gustavo had gone to Odum first, and he referred them to me. And I think the Corps of Engineers went to Odum, and he referred them to me. They wanted to look at the impact of the grass carp, an Asian fish, on hydrilla. And they were going to do a field project in Lake Conway in Central Florida. And so I had a contract for 2 or 3 years, and Tom Fontaine was a graduate student, and he did his PhD on it, and that worked out very well. By that time, I'd left the analog computer behind, and I was using a language called CSMP, continuous system model, continuous simulation modeling program, and it was based on Fortran, and so I used that really for the rest of my, just about the rest of my modeling career. And but it was very interesting because I couldn't get paid, and then I was also starting to work on Cypress Swamp of course with well, let me back up a little bit. So when I got to Florida and didn't have a job, Odum was just beginning. He had done a seminar on using alternative systems for sewage treatment. Water pollution was a huge issue, and he said, well, maybe we should be looking at wetlands because these places are already wet, and so we can put the sewage in there. And so he had gotten some money from the Rockefeller Foundation to do some initial work, and then he got a big slug of money from Research Applied to National Needs from the National Science Foundation. And so he put me on as a postdoc, but since I was already being paid something by, I don't remember if it was botany or forestry or whoever, in one silo, I couldn't get my money from 2 silos. So I couldn't get my money from the grant itself. And so IFAS ended up picking up my salary, and I continued to do some teaching and so forth for forestry. So Sam Snedeker and I spent a day driving around Alachua County, and we found Whitney Trailer Park, and it had these cypress domes around it on Owens, Illinois land. And that was a wonderful site for it, and that worked out very, very well. And so so during that first stretch of time, I was a postdoc. And then when the next, I think it was 2 years later, when the next money came, proposal was funded, then I was a co-PI. And so I was co-PI for, I think, the next 8 years, something like that. We, as first from the National Science Foundation, and then we had some EPA money also, and also some local GRU money. So we did work together that whole time. And of course, during that time, he was getting excited about energy. And so he had gotten the center started, and Ariel, of course, was the first interim director, and then Ronnie Best came. And so most of my dealings were really, I mean, Odum's attention was really drifting. I mean, he was interested, and he certainly, I had a lot to say about how things were to be done. I'll have to say that one of the things I remember most about this, we had a cypress dome that we were putting secondarily treated sewage into. And then we had a control dome, and then we had a control dome next to it, into which we were putting just regular water. So we're having a hydrologic control there. And then we also had a dome in the Austin Gary Forest, which was a complete control dome. And so we were working in all 3 of those sites. And let's see, I'm in a senior moment here trying to think how this all worked out. We had a number of people in different departments doing various things, and we had someone who's interested in fish. And so Odum had said, well, he was about to go to New Zealand or someplace for the summer. And he
Yeah.
said he wanted us to lower a big net down into the Cypress Dome and use that to figure out the biomass of fish at that time. And I thought, oh my God. And so we went out, the poor graduate student, I mean, you know what a cypress dome is. Of course, there are these cypress trees, there are these knees sticking up, there are hummocks of bushes, and there's no way that you could really put a seine in there
Yeah,
and
and then lift it
calculate
up.
fish biomass. Absolutely no way. And it wasn't until years later when I saw a program. There was a movie that sort of documented Odum's career, and it showed his work at Texas, at Aransas, where there was this helicopter that lowered a big cylindrical net into
Yeah,
the estuary, and then it came together at the bottom, and they pulled it up, and that was the fish. And that's what he wanted.
that's not even.
Completely impossible. And so when he came back, he was upset that we didn't do it. And I said,
Didn't
well,
do
it's just not.
it.
But I'm sure that he was disappointed in me.
Yeah.
But we did find out, what fish were there. We did do a few good things with fish that were
Yeah.
helpful. So he was, he was really interested in what was going on, but he had less and less impact, really. And then at the end, when we were doing, we'd finished the research applied to national needs. They gave us another project to do an economic analysis. Well, here's HT developing energy. We
Right.
want an economic analysis. This was too traditional for him, really.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
we went ahead and did it, and they did a very good job of it. But I was working, mostly with them, helping to get the information together. And it was, it was published, and that was fine. But he was just clearly at the end of that point, he was pretty much done with biology.
Mhm.
But we worked well together. The Cypress Swamps book, let's see, let me think how this happened. In 1977, I came back in 71. 1977, I finally got a job with a tenure track position with Forest Resources and Conservation. And so I was teaching simulation of ecological models in the wetland wildlife resources, and I had started to branch out. I did some work on cypress on the NSF project, but I had the forest industry people let me know that there was a crisis coming up with cypress being harvested, and so I got interested in the impacts of harvesting on cypress, and got to work on that, and so that really took me into the next big step. And of course, we also did the Dominican Republic model, and we did the grass carp model, but my modeling efforts I was using models really as to construct budgets, to see how much goes where and when. It wasn't so much in hypothesis testing or anything like that, but it was really just, it was really a tool to see how the numbers all fit together.
Right.
And so we really went in different directions after that because of it. So that's a synopsis of my work with HT.
That was the easiest interview ever. One question. No, I thought maybe we'd go back and follow up on a few things. One is maybe just kind of a little bit review for our audience what the Cypress Dome project was all about. You talked about a little bit how it started. So this is the idea to see how we could use wastewater in wetlands, and Odum had done a little bit in Morehead City, right,
Yep.
with on the coast there. So this is kind of taking it to the next step.
Yes, and it was a very logical step for him, and it was a big step for the country. Really, there were a few places that were doing putting wastewater into wetlands, peatlands in rural areas, places like that. NSF funded another project at the University of Michigan, and John and Bob Cadlick, brothers, were the two PIs, and then Kurt Richardson, who had actually been in graduate school with me for one semester. He was he and Bob Cadlick really were the big players there, and they were doing a peatland in northern Michigan. I can't remember the name of the place anymore. And so we had these parallel projects, and we met together frequently. Some of us went up there to see their stuff, and they came down to see our stuff, and so we had these two projects to sort of introduce the breadth of systems that could be used. As it turns out, Florida approved the use of cypress domes for treating secondarily treated wastewater to the tertiary advanced wastewater treatment level, but they had to be individually approved. There was not a blanket rule. They would look at it. And in fact, they did have a project in Pinellas County. And one of my graduate students, Sandra Upchurch, actually worked for several years at that on that project, monitoring it and so forth. But it really never went anywhere after that. The Michigan group did a lot more on, Kurt and Bob took different directions in that project, and Kurt really made a name for himself looking at phosphorus in wetlands. And I think that there are more wastewater treatment systems based on peatlands than in swamps, than in forested wetlands.
That's really amazing. I mean, thinking about, today, how we think about ecological engineering, and you really think of the treatment wetland as that prototypical technology, natural technology. And you were there at the beginning of it,
Yeah.
during some of the,
well,
maybe.
Yes, and I should let me mention one thing. I'm embarrassed I didn't mention it before. Of course, Bob Knight, who was a graduate student of Odum's at that time, and he did the redo of the Silver Springs project that HT had analyzed as a young faculty member when he was starting his career. And Bob spent his career creating wastewater treatment systems in natural areas. And so Paynes Prairie here in Gainesville has what's called Sweetwater Wetlands, and it's a very attractive tourist site. In fact, I was out there yesterday, boardwalk through the edge of the marsh, which has been engineered to take the spring water coming from the Sweetwater branch, and then of course it gets a lot of urban pollution along the way, and then it goes through a couple of settling ponds and then into the marsh, and so you can walk on this boardwalk and see all these different things. So actually that was really the result of all this research, was the construction of wetlands specifically to do wastewater treatment, and that has been very useful in a lot of places.
Was there a parallel project to do any constructed wetlands at that point? I mean, that comes much later, and maybe Sweetwater was one of the first ones that really did that. It sounds like, right?
I think most of it came later.
I mean, did you have any idea that this would turn into like an industry of wastewater treatment?
Well,
the way it has.
HT thought it was really, we had to do something like this, and he was so effusive about it that I was caught up too. I felt as though, we had a woman, Flora May, can't remember her last name.
Wells.
Yeah, she did the viruses, and she said, and she would get up, we'd give our seminar, like we'd be at a professional meeting, and I'd give my stuff and someone else give their stuff, and she said, well, I'm the crepe hanger. Because in fact the viruses did leak out of the system and into the groundwater, and we weren't really dealing as well with the bacteria and viruses as we had hoped.
Do you think that was the case, them just being overloaded, or is just some
overloaded? wrong soil type. Kurt pointed out one of the things that Kurt found is that the best treatment is where you have mineral soil with some organic matter. And so, sometimes there wasn't, there just wasn't enough of a holding capacity. And other times it couldn't take the additional water.
Well, you just had so many fascinating pieces there. The analog computer, and then you switched over to digital. That must have been like, what was going on then? Like, did you know what digital computers? You knew what they were. They just weren't accessible, I guess,
Oh,
back then, right?
well, the digital computer was the university's computer, which was right in the middle of campus, and you had to. Your model consisted of a whole deck of cards that you had to put through a card punch, and then Jack would drive me over to the computer center at like late in the evening, so I could get it punched and put it into the system. And then you come back in the morning and you get your printout, which is just pages and pages of whatever you wanted. And at that time, I was teaching simulation of ecological models during the summer. For a half, we had summer A, and so it was like 6 weeks, and it took you overnight to do the model. And then, I mean, we were meeting twice a week, and it was just terrible for the students because the computers were so slow and they couldn't keep up with it. And we were just then coming into desktops. And in fact, I think it was a year or two. Well, actually, it was probably more than that. I was the first person in New and Ziegler Hall to have a desktop computer. And it was an Apple because it had HT's energy flow symbols in it, and you could create a model on that desktop computer. I kept it on a little mobile tray so that if somebody else wanted to use it, we could just roll it to their office and they could use it, because the university gave it to me. As I did a little teaching project. I created it was a laboratory simulation of, I guess it was predator prey, that a student could do, and they could just decide, they could put in how much for the predator, how much for the prey, and then it would run the model. And in fact, Charlie Hall got a copy of it and he took it up to Cornell and he used it in his class, and he didn't like it because you couldn't change the model. You could put in the numbers, but you couldn't change the model. And so he didn't think that was so great. I actually did publish the model, and I gave it to oh dear me, it was the Dane that Bill Mitch worked with so much.
Jorgensen, Sven Jorgensen.
Yes. I gave it to Sven Jorgensen, who was running the I can't think of the name of the what was the group called, the Professional Society of Ecological Modeling.
Oh, the ecological modeling, yeah.
Yeah, and so he was going to he wanted to sell it for like $400, and I said, no, Sven, it's not realistic. And I never did find out how many copies he sold, or how well it was used. That was really at that point. It wasn't long then until I left Florida. And when I left Florida, I left modeling behind. I just didn't, it just didn't, wasn't anything I needed for the stuff I did with mangroves and freshwater swamps. But it was wonderful. It was, and I really felt, like I was on the edge of things, just stepping in and really getting things going. And it was very, very heady stuff.
Yeah.
I didn't have imposter syndrome because I knew that I knew more than a lot of people did.
Right. So in terms of so you were doing some of this in Chapel Hill, some of the analog stuff you started in Chapel Hill.
That's where I started. Yeah.
Right. So what was the interaction with Odum like when you were doing the analog modeling? Like, would he be there in the room with you, or are you just kind of just showing him output, or is he kind of helping you build the models, or are you just showing him what you're doing, or?
I would show him what I was doing, and I didn't really interact. I was just learning at that point, and I might have had a couple of sessions on the computer. It wasn't until I got to Florida, and I had a little bit of spare time at the beginning, and he had all these graduate students, Jim Zucchetto and John Richardson and all these people, and they had and let's see, we had an analog computer that we used in nuclear engineering. But then it seems to me they had some early desktops down there. And John Richardson, he was in charge of the desktop, and he gave me a disk on which people could save their models. And so I could save my model on that disk, and then when I wanted to go down and work on it again, I'd have to get that disk back from John and put it in so I could find my model. And so it was, I mean, the whole industry was really changing very, very rapidly.
Must be a lot of
John,
parallels. I don't know if you
yeah.
keep up with how things have changed in the last few years, but and just the
Oh,
whole artificial intelligence and what's capable
well,
to do
yes, and
now.
R. You know, I missed out on the whole R thing, and
The statistical package, yeah.
yeah.
Everybody's using that now, and for simulation, for anything, you know, it's amazing.
Yes, yeah.
And there's people writing little routines that they publish.
Yep.
I mean, it's really taken off. It's
Yep.
Unfortunately, I missed it too.
Yeah.
And to go back and learn something new at this age, it just doesn't happen.
You can't take your foot off the accelerator, I don't think, when it comes to technology.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in, you know, the simulation is such a big part of HT's idea of simulation was
Yep.
the diagramming and being
Yes.
able to draw a diagram and from the diagram write equations. And then did you use that? Was that the way that you simulated, was to first diagram it and then to translate it into into
yes, it
equations?
was, because when you're writing out code, I mean, you have this long stretch of equations, and so you really had to have some way of summarizing it. So I always had a model to summarize it, and
Yeah.
and so that was helpful. And of course, what Odum was big on at that point were mini models,
Yeah.
so that you could boil things down to, you know, to simple situations. And I did a little bit of that, but and I used that in the course quite a bit.
Mm.
Here's an example. Is this one? This looks like this is from your chapter 10 in Cypress Swamps.
Yep.
So you're simulating that, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's the one that I did on that's the Dominican Republic, I think, isn't it? So that was on the analog, because I had each of the land use systems as a capacitor.
I see it's got cypress foliage, wood litter,
Oh no,
duckweed.
okay, that was
This is the dome, I
yeah,
think.
that's right. I think that was Gary Deggy's.
Yeah, Gary. Yeah, that's your co-author. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. Wow.
I can't remember if he did. I think he must have done that on the analog.
What's interesting to me is like it's timeless, like how we laid out the models and the tables
Yes.
and all the coefficients and equations. Because I was still doing that in the 90s when I was a grad student. We're still
Well,
doing it now.
when Gary graduated with his master's degree and he went to work for a consulting firm, they put him to work. He made a big hit because he could model the movement of cars at a stoplight. So once the light turns, he could model the rate at which cars sped up and moved through that stoplight, and so he could help design traffic systems for cities. And he did very well as a consultant.
So he went from ecology to traffic engineer.
Yeah. Yep. Well, that was the whole idea, is that all these things are similar in different systems, and what you learn from one system, you can put into another.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's, to me, that's just one of the most powerful things about Odum's approach was the generality.
Yeah.
You know, and I remember taking a course in economics when I was an undergraduate because I was thinking about like double majoring or something. And you saw that the math was very similar to the engineering course I had just taken. And this is before I knew Odum or anything.
Yeah.
And then when I got to Odum, it's just like, oh my God, like there's a whole language you can just use in symbology to put all this stuff together. And it's the same math. You know, that was just, to me, that was just a huge,
well,
epiphany in my
I had
thinking.
gotten a D in calculus in college. I didn't have the slightest idea what was going on. And then once I saw it in symbols and put it together like that, I mean, I still wasn't all that great on things like partial derivatives, but I understood. And I would tell, I have a very good friend who's a math professor, he wasn't impressed. And they, I still don't see math classes using that kind of approach,
No.
which is a shame.
Yeah, it really is a shame because you can make it understandable to the masses.
Yes, yeah,
That you can't with just writing equations on a board. And
yeah.
it was so powerful. And I, like you, barely got through calculus, but once I got to drawing those diagrams and writing the difference equations from that and realizing that all of that gobbledygook of derivatives was really difference equations is all it was,
Yeah, yeah,
whoa, it really
yeah,
changed the way I saw things.
yeah.
Mm.
It's kind of like when the really great musicians and like rock music that don't know how to read music,
Yes, yep.
they know how to create, they have their own system of creating it and understanding it. So I think there's some analogy there.
Well, it's like the connection between physics and music. A lot
Yeah.
of physicists are also good musicians.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's, they're all rhythms, sine waves. It's all,
Yeah, yeah. And it's
part of
math.
the same. Yep.
Music is really a lot of math.
Yeah.
So the mini models, did you, you said you had a prey predator. Did you have any other models that you would consider to be what Odum called macroscopic mini models?
I
Testing.
don't think so. I
Uh-huh.
don't think so.
So you were all doing those really complex ones.
Well, I really was, finding a way to understand my data and
Uh-huh.
not so much the system as
Okay.
having a place to put the data
Yeah,
and knowing what data I needed. That was the big thing, was where are the weak spots and what we know about this ecosystem.
right. And the way to get that is to diagram it, number one.
Yes.
You start, well, I don't have that data, but it's obviously, as I think through the system, that's really
Mhm.
important.
Yeah, the model that I'm most proud of, I guess, is Henry Goals and I were working on pine flatwoods, and I did a model of carbon flow through pine flatwoods, and I think it was carbon, phosphorus, and water, and it came out very, very well. Put in our data, we could sort of figure out. If we didn't know a flow, we could look at how the model worked and get some idea of what the magnitude was likely to be.
Mhm.
And that got published in Forest Science. And so I got a lot of good feedback from that.
Yeah,
It was really quite an effort.
right. Well, is there anything in your long history here at U of F and with HT that stands out in your mind, interactions with him that were mind-blowing or that set you off in a direction?
Well, one thing I have to say about him is that he was very good to women. He found a place for me. Flora Wong came along, very good hydrologist. He found a place for her. And Martha Gilliland was one of his graduate students at that time. She was a little bit older than the other graduate students, and she had a family. And I remember that at the end of the fall semester, he gave his graduate students their marching orders. He says, in January, I want to see a proposal. I want to see this. I want to see a rough draft of that, and so forth. And Martha said, look, I have 2 children and their grandparents are coming. I have a house full of people. I have to do Christmas for these children. I am not going to be able to do this. And he, it took him aback. But he said, I remember he said, well, you can't expect the same thing of women because they have other things in their lives. Like the men didn't have to do anything about Christmas and taking care of the children and the grandparents, but the women sure did. And he was really, of course, Suzanne Bailey was working with him too, and he was very helpful to women.
Right.
And Ed Pyatt, who was the chair at that time, he was also.
Yeah.
So I guess he had met Betty when he moved to Florida, right? Betty Odum, because his other wife had passed in Chapel Hill.
His first wife, Virginia, passed away when they were at Florida. In fact, that was, I can remember we were away, I think it was 82. We did a sabbatical. and I came back and Virginia had died. And so Mary was in, I think she was in high school, and Anne, I think Anne was in college. Anne was having, she was a schizophrenic, as it turns out, and it's happened in the family, and so he was really having a hard time bridging the gap after Virginia died, because she needed so much of his attention. And I have to say, he finally, he won the Tyler Award. He apparently had spent most of the Tyler Award on trying to help Anne, and he finally sent her to the hospital. Is it Chattahoochee? I can't remember the name. It was near Tallahassee. It was the state hospital, and it was the last resort that he had, and there was a young doctor there who was just experimenting with drugs, and he found the way for Anne to live a normal life. And he came up with the right balance for her. She was an artist, and she did lose her artistic inspiration once she went on these drugs, but she lived for several more years and had friends and had a fairly normal existence. So that was very gratifying. And he met Betty not long after Virginia died. He started going to Parents Without Partners. And Betty was freshly divorced. She had 4 children. And so they met and very quickly got married and melded their families. And he had this very nice house on a pond near Gainesville, and they added an addition so that the various children could be there together, because her children, I think, were a little bit younger than Anne and Mary. And but it was just that really helped him a tremendous amount. It took him off, and her effect, I think, was in getting him to write more for the common person, for the uneducated person. And so that was a big step.
Yeah,
because they did energy basis for man.
Their courtship was the writing of the energy basis for man,
Yes.
man and nature.
Yeah.
Actually, and I remember one day I was walking to lunch with him, and he was talking, and he said, how do you deal with women? And I said, well, it can be difficult at times, but it's okay. I kind of like it. And he said, well, I'm either going to have to marry her or I'm going to have to never see her again. And then they got married. But she used to always say that it was her influence that kept trying to make him, and she was the one that wanted him to put cartoons in his books, because she said people relate to cartoons, they like funny stories and so forth. So Man and Nature is filled with these little cartoons that they cut out of magazines and whatnot, newspapers.
I still remember him bringing cartoons into like general systems course when he would teach it.
Yeah.
And have some kind of principle he'd want you to understand from that cartoon.
Did you never took his course, Ecological and General Systems, did you?
Well, I sat in on it at Chapel Hill.
Okay. And at that time, his famous tests were to put up these pictures in the hallway, and you had to go and figure out what it was that he was trying to what he was trying to ask you. I mean, they were the most bizarre things. There would be a picture of a coral reef next to a picture of something else, and what's this general principle that both of these la 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 la, it was. And
the thing that always cracked everybody up was the small boat man. Was it a man in a small boat, or was it a small man in a boat? There were always things like that you're never quite sure what he meant.
Right.
You're giving me some ideas for my final exam coming up.
Yeah. His tests were legendary. I've got them all, David, if you want them.
I remember the one I took. Yeah, I don't remember all the pictures, but I'm sure that was the oddest test I ever took as a graduate student.
Really? I mean, he literally had these things pictures pasted on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, and he would put them out in the hallway. Each one of them was numbered, and you went along and you had to figure out what the question was often, and then try to figure out what the answer was. But there'd be 10 or 20 of them, and the students all be walking down the hall,
Yeah.
one side of the hall and down the other. Oh,
Um, so the Cypress swamps, that finished up in the late 70s, early 80s. So, right. That's, you said 8
Yeah.
years. So around 80.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And the book came out in 84, and it took a couple of years to put together. Fortunately, he went to New Zealand, so so we had different viewpoints on how to put a book together. And I was everything. I wasn't to reject anything. And I have to tell you, there's one faculty member who's a guy who I like quite a bit, who I had to work with a lot to get a publishable paper out of him. But yeah, that was, I guess it was.
And Odum wanted to record everything that had been done, regardless of the presumed quality. Is that?
Yep. There was
So
nothing.
he went.
There wasn't any such thing as a bad model.
that was
all
HT.
information.
I mean, HT there was never any such thing as a bad anything, Do you remember the early on in the Cypress project, when the fire that resulted from the from the guys welding that people on the railroad had started a forest fire, and it went through the dome?
Yes, and I thought that happened like on a Thursday or Friday, and he called a special meeting Saturday morning at the Center for Wetlands. And so I thought, well, this is it. This is the end of it. We'll give the money back to NSF. And I walked in, and he said, this is an opportunity. And so Bill Mitch and I went through, and we looked at which trees survived and which didn't, and we published a paper on the effect of fire on cypress domes. And I used fire, or I looked at fire. I never burned it myself anything, but I was kind of an advocate of fire in wetlands, of considering the impacts of fire in wetlands. And I mean, that was a perfect Odum moment, really. I mean, whenever it looks terrible, it's an opportunity.
Yep. So I recall that the students were all going, "Oh my God, my dissertation, my thesis, they're all gone," and he walks in and he says, "It's an opportunity to study the effect of fire, but also the effect of sewage in a burn dome."
Yes, that's right.
There's a lot of burn domes out there.
Just in case we're wondering.
Perfect opportunity. Yep.
Must have really reset the succession, open up the canopy. Or does the cypress, they don't burn, right?
Well, as it turns out, pond cypress is resistant to fire. And bald cypress, on the other hand, is not. And so Mike Duver, at the same time, I think it was Rockefeller provided the money for Mike Duver to work at Corkscrew Swamp, to look at the characteristics of that big swamp. And so Mike would go back and forth from the
Naples area.
Yeah, but what's the name of the swamp?
Well, it was Corkscrew.
Yeah, Corkscrew. And he'd go back and forth from Gainesville to Corkscrew. And so the projects were kind of in parallel. And we had our Austin Carey swamp here, which was all cypress. But at Corkscrew, there was dwarf cypress, pond cypress on the edge. And then as you got deeper, bald cypress. And so it wasn't unusual. Bald cypress didn't see fire very much because they didn't have they didn't accumulate quite so much fuel, but they were also less resistant to fire than pond cypress. And so we were able to document that, at least the resistance in the two burn domes, the freshwater dome and then the sewage dome, and then compare it with the control dome.
Yeah. So one of the things he always liked pointing out about the pond cypress was how he thought it was it evolved as a mechanism to conserve water on the landscape because of the reflectance pattern was different from bald. And he had his
Yes.
radiometer that he was, I don't know what, so I'm wondering like the history of where the radiometer came in his life. And
Well, he really believed in that, and he got me to believe in it. We tried to test it. Henry Goals built a huge tower, and he was looking at evapotranspiration from slash pine and from cypress, and nobody could ever find a difference. And then in the seminars that we had this fall, Dan
Kaplan. No, not Dave. That's David Kaplan.
but
Dan.
Dave Kaplan's friend, Dan.
Oh, the guy from Mark's former student
from VPI.
Not Hitchcock, but
McLaughlin.
Yeah, McLaughlin. He gives this wonderful seminar showing that that the cypress domes hold the water in the landscape, and so it doesn't matter so much that what the ET was. It was really the physical effect of the soil that made them conserve water. So he was right. I don't think, I said to him, you just vindicated the HT Odum, and I think he didn't understand what vindicated meant.
Good or bad.
I mean, it was to me, it was just wonderful.
Yeah.
And I have to say, along the same line, Bill Odum, his nephew, had said that, pointed out that stuff watching out for mangrove swamps feeds the estuary. Well, no one could ever prove it, and they said, no, it's all wrong. And then Carol McIver did a very nice the elements that are radioactive that you put into
the tracers.
Yes, the tracers, using tracers, found that in fact the mangrove swamps do feed the estuary. She vindicated Bill Odum.
Yeah.
And this is decades later.
Right. That's a good one. Might see Dan in a few weeks, so I'll have to ask him.
Yeah.
How he's feeling.
Stable isotopes. That was the word I was trying to come up with. Stable isotopes.
And then, so when you're teaching, so you taught the modeling some as well, right? And
yeah,
as a pure like
graduate
course.
Ecological models. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So how did your students receive it? I mean, did they struggle or mixed bag?
I had each of them do a simple model. I made them keep it simple. And a couple of years ago, Jack was teaching tropical ecology at the time, and we got a letter. This is probably 20 years later, 20 or 30 years later. We get this letter from a guy who was an archaeologist, and he was in both of our courses, and so he did a little mini model on the decomposition of archaeological ruins. And he published it. And he looked at how things decompose and work into the soil and so forth. And it was just a small model, and it was something that archaeologists had never thought of before, and it got published. And so a lot of them came through that way. Very seldom did I have somebody who just things just didn't click. That we tried to keep it very simple, and so that they could get a result, and they did. And some people went on with it, and probably most didn't, but at least they learned about something else that was useful.
Yeah.
It's always so rewarding when you get those kind of stories later on after you've taught somebody something.
Yeah.
They're little gems in your cap there.
Well, any other thoughts about the trial and trails that you and HT intersected? And I heard you say that you didn't agree too much on the publication of the book, and that, as I understand it, you finally got it done when he left the country.
Well, that's why I was senior author, because I basically, he was in New Zealand, and I could fax things to him, but I did most of the editing, and I did most of the work, and but it does, I hope it does have his patina on it. You know,
Yeah. Oh, sure it does, for sure. It's a great book. It's really used it a lot when I taught wetlands ecology. It was a good
well, bless your heart.
one. Well, this has been great. Thank you, Kathy, very, very much. Parting thought at all?
Well, it's you know, it was just such a wonderful experience being able to work with somebody like that, and it just keeps you always thinking of, you know, what am I missing? What, you know, what is the dimension that I'm not paying attention to? And it just, I mean, it sets
Yeah.
your whole life. And so even though what I ended up doing was not what he might have liked to have seen somebody do, you know, I didn't get into emergy and so forth. It was really, it was just a wonderful experience for me, and I'm very glad that I got to work with him.
Yeah.
I think one of the questions I like to ask here at the end is, you know, if he were here today alive, do you have like a burning question you'd love to ask him about, or
Well,
any
you know,
topic?
there were a couple things that I just never really agreed with him on, and I don't know if he would have changed his mind. One of which was, it's okay to scatter trash all over the area, all over the environment, so that things, you know, get to mix each other. It's fine to introduce other species into your ecosystems, and then but I take the traditional viewpoint of alien species are not a good thing to to bring into stable ecosystems. They can destabilize everything, and you end up with with much lower diversity than you had before. And then you start thinking, well, you know, of what importance is diversity in this particular situation? And you know, what is our standard that makes me think that this is bad and he thinks that that's good? And I think he's just willing to overlook a lot of trash. To him, trash is a resource.
Well, there was the project they did in Austin Cary Forest, right? Well, they put the trash out. Nobody ever talks about that project very much, but they put the municipal waste out into the forest, right? And then they planted the pine forest on it.
Yep.
Yes, yeah,
And it's still there today.
yeah.
Is that right? Or maybe they've
And
cut it by now.
they showed an increased growth rate
Yeah.
on those trees, a little bit, not much, but a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was you, Mark, or somebody, or maybe we saw one of the, we had a party out there for maybe when Ronnie Best was retiring or something. And we met somebody who had maintained the grounds there, and they were complaining about hitting the trash with their mower or something.
I don't doubt it. My house is built on top of the old Hawthorne to Gainesville trail, not road, trail. And there is trash all along this trail. So my property is a landfill. I mean, all of the organics are long gone, but there's bottles, old bottles, you know, early 1900 bottles and cans that are just barely there. I mean, it's it all goes eventually. The stuff that takes the longest is still around. Yeah.
And it's wonderful when we find them as archaeological
Right.
wishing there was more.
I have people coming out here traipsing through with metal detectors trying to find stuff on the old trail. It's kind of intriguing. My bedroom sits right on top of the old trail.
Nice. You need your archaeology students' little model. You can figure out all the things you should be able to find out there.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, yeah, Kathy, I really appreciate it. We've been having a lot of fun with this, so it's really great to hear from you and hear your perspective. And it's very unique work you did with him, and glad we captured it here and we're able to share it with other people. Yeah, that's the important part.
Well, thanks very much. I enjoyed it a lot, and I appreciate your doing this.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn the recording off here.
Yeah.